Welcome to the people online and the people who will follow afterwards this online interview, this online lecture. I know Lukas a few years now, just online, of course. I've been following his work on modernity, on political theories, and quite recently, I just saw an interesting article about modernity and how to get past this point of modernity and post-modernity and the crisis that is currently spreading in our society, in our Western society. So I gave him a call to give us a lecture about these topics, and I'm curious about your vision now, Lucas. So just go along and we'll ask questions later.
Well, sure. Well, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. So yes, the topic of modernity is something that I have been very interested about for a few years now, and I guess you could say my interest in it. Well, here, let me give a little background about myself that might help put this into context. So a few years ago, I had I was well. Let me put it like this: I grew up in my early 20s as a staunch anti-modernist. I was introduced. I think I had read *Decline of the West* my sophomore year of high school. I had probably gotten into the works of Julius Evola in my early 20s, and that had kind of carried me along this path where I had kind of delved into not only like the radical traditionalists, but I was deeply I was heavily reading, the sacred scriptures of all these major world religions to kind of like prop up my traditionalism, right? Um, but a few years ago, I had an incident um, at my. Well, I should explain. Like I was baptized an Orthodox Christian, and at the time when I was writing for the Warden Post, which is a now defunct revolutionary conservative website that I was the managing editor for. My godfather, who is a kind of like a big Christian Democrat, maybe he's certainly not on the right, let's call it, had actually introduced, without my consent, my writings to some of the priests there, and I basically had to explain for roughly an hour or so to not only two priests but the president of the parish council how I was not the second coming of Matthew Heimbach in front of my then ex girlfriend at the time, which was incredibly awkward and infuriating. And I came away from that experience thinking to myself, like, well, hold on. Like, I thought the Orthodox Church was supposed to be this bastion of traditionalism and tradition against, modern or postmodern subversion. And it got me thinking, right? Well, what if traditionalism isn't the answer? And I know that must sound anathema to maybe a lot of your viewers because I suspect that a lot of the people who listen to these channels are maybe they're nationalists or maybe they're traditionalists or reactionaries of all kinds of stripes. But in the wake of that event, I became introduced to maybe a philosophy is not the correct word, but a way of thinking um, about the world or about our situation, right? Our situation in this point in time in our history, called metamodernism, which it's finally kind of you know bubbling to the surface in right wing circles, but at the time was a very niche and is still a very niche subject, especially within the right wing. And metamodernism, just to put it simply, was the brain project of these two Dutch architectural theorists. Um, I believe their names were let me see. I have my notes here. I know their last names are Vermeulen and van der Aken. Um, But anyway, these two gentlemen were thinking about how architecture um, had kind of, how postmodern and modern architecture had kind of like bounced off each other in these intellectual circles as like structural designs. And that got them thinking, well, what if we're at the beginning of something new that's kind of going beyond the kind of modern postmodern dichotomy? And that led them to formulate this way of thinking about things called metamodernism, which was picked up by numerous authors, particularly on the left, the libertarian left, I should specify, but is now kind of bleeding over into the right simply because, well, I'll put it like this: metamodernism isn't so much a philosophical doctrine as it is a way of thinking about the world. It's essentially a kind of political non-dualism, right? The working definition for metamodernism is, an oscillation between modernism and postmodernism. Well, of course, that doesn't make any sense for someone on the right. And I had written um, in one of my last articles, I believe, for the Warden Post. I think it was the very last article before that website had gone under. Um, that what we on the right are kind of experiencing now is this dialectic, or this dialectical tension that seems to oscillate between archaism or radical traditionalism and futurism. And you see this now, especially in the works of the French New Right, which styled itself as being non-reactionary comparative to uh, a lot of the more traditionalist elements of the right, which were kind of making a resurgence in Europe and later the Anglo sphere in the 2010s. You see this with Dugin's fourth political theory, which is essentially just kind of a weird marriage between radical traditionalism and postmodernism. And you also see this with the works of Jason Reza Georgiani, who has kind of disavowed traditionalism entirely and has tried to come up with this kind of Nietzschean, futurist, Promethean ethos that he has kind of made into his own thing. And of course, you have like the works of people like Nick Land and Mencius Mollberg in the United States with the neo-reactionary movement. So this tension between traditionalism or foundationalism and futurism has been there for quite a while, and it's finally kind of making itself manifest in this circle in which I have been a very big contributor, known as the meta right, which I got into. Again, I was introduced to by my friend and mutual colleague Kasha Fikas, who's kind of like a literal internet nomad. He kind of bounces around from place to place, and just kind of speaks on different philosophical contexts to whoever, or concepts to whoever will listen. And I should mention, I do have a website now. You can find my writings as well as the writings of a lot of other authors at metanaissance.com, which is supposed to be, I had established the site to be like a kind of a central hub for, writers and from across not just the right, but the dissident left as well, who don't really fit neatly into this kind of left-right paradigm, right? On the new right, we there was that saying that was very common, beyond left and right, but against the center. And I kind of took that to heart. I owe it to people like Alain de Benoit, who kind of got me away from my former weird, social democratic views, which were not really, I mean, they weren't reconcilable with anything I believed, but I hadn't been introduced to anything else, because in America, when you think conservatism, you think of like the kind of neocon, Reaganite conservatism of like that had dominated American discourse like in the Bush years. And I found that to be absolutely repulsive. And, it was reading the works of people like Alain de Benoit, but especially Guillaume Faye, whose archaeofuturism I would dare to argue is the foundational text of the meta right. It certainly has had a huge impact on me. Along with, I would also just plug A. Severin's very short book, Metamodernism and the Return of Transcendence. Very short book, probably a little over 100 pages. But, you know, in terms of laying out like where we are in this historical moment, I think it's incomparable, especially when you read a lot of other metamodernist texts, because they are, I mean, the downside is, um, metamodernism has the misfortune, I would say, of being exclusively dominated by, again, left libertarian thinkers, and that, and their bias kind of seeps into their works. But I would like to reiterate that metamodernism is less of a political theory than it is more of like a toolbox. It's an an epistemological toolbox of kind of, you know, getting a feel of, you know, where we are in this historical moment at the tail end of late postmodernity, and kind of like what is coming next. And that has been the big um, struggle between metamodernists both on the right and the left, because you have metamodernists on the left, and I'm thinking predominantly of people like Hansi Freinacht, who uh, you know, he has made political metamodernism his own thing, but it has nothing to do with us, you know, on the meta right. And in fact, he actually loathes the fact that we exist. But metamodernism on the left is trying to kind of save. It's trying to save the what do you call it? The values of the Enlightenment, the you know, the social welfare projects that have come to dominate Northern Europe, you know, especially the Scandinavian countries, you know, liberalism, social democracy, the welfare state, whatever you have it, human rights. And of course, that doesn't make sense to us on the right, because those things, you know, to us, and rightly so, are a product of subversion. They're subversive ideologies that have kind of dissolved um, the unity, right? The unity of nation states, the unity of our civilization. And for us, you know, we are kind of reading the tea leaves differently. And it's like, well, okay. And this has been my big gripe with traditionalists. It's like, let's say, right, let's assume that somehow the postmodern world kind of goes under due to its own internal contradictions. What comes next? And if you ask a lot of traditionalists, I mean, to them, there's almost like this assumption that we're going to return to um, like this new feudal system, or this new aristocracy where we have like a warrior nobility, and, you know, a kind of new caste system, or a system of the estates that's either going to be neo-pagan or a revived traditional Catholicism or something like that. And I'm thinking, I mean, is it really possible to see like a real spiritual revival in Europe, either from traditional Catholicism or neo-paganism at this moment? And I think the answer is no. I mean, obviously, I mean, I know a lot of us are very, you know, we want to kind of return to our native faiths, however we choose to define them. But we have to understand, and this is the sad reality, is that Europe, as it stands, is more of like it's a museum. It's a museum the size of a small continent, you know. And I know I'm dealing with Europeans here, but I guess maybe from the perspective of a North American looking outward, it's like, well, what comes next? It's like we have, like, you know, Europeans voted for and continue to vote for, you know, these programs that go against their interests, because they have like the luxury economy that they've enjoyed for so long kind of being dangled in front of them by their politicians. And I don't know, like, that's the thing, is I don't know what comes next, but it's not going to be like a return, you know, to these traditional aristocracies, or maybe, you know, I don't think it's coming back. You know, Jonathan Bowden, the late great Jonathan Bowden, when he was asked about his political views, would always say, like, when he would say, well, I believe in an enlightened aristocracy, but I don't see that coming back, enlightened or otherwise. And I'm kind of among the same opinion. So here, I guess I should specify, like, okay, so where are we, right? We are definitely at the end of something. Whatever you want to call that, late capitalism or late post-modernity. And the question, I think, for the meta right and for us, for any person on the right who is curious about where we are and where we're going, is what comes next. In my opinion, right, I think that, not to sound apocalyptic, but we are probably headed toward what Guillaume Fay called the convergence of catastrophes, right? Or what I have called like the slow death of our global kind of economy or civilization or whatever you want to call it. So what I think should preoccupy, like thinking people on the right is, how do we build a network, whether that be an intellectual system or mutual assistance groups that kind of survive this kind of slow collapse of the system as we kind of descend into something else. I think we get really preoccupied on the right about like this event, called the collapse or whatever, and we don't really think about what comes after. We have like this assumption that somehow, somewhere, we will win. Like we will win this struggle against whatever you want to call it: global subversion, neoliberalism, capitalism. Pick any boogeyman you want. But I mean, I think back to Alex Kurtizic's Masters of the Universe speech, which has kind of gone down the memory hole. But he made the good point. It's like, well, if everything goes under, that means there's a clean slate for everyone, even for groups that might be diametrically opposed to our existence. And, well, for one, I don't think there will be a major sudden collapse necessarily. I think it's tragically, in the West, we're going to see the slow third worldization of our nations. But what we should keep in mind is, like, look, even after the collapse and after this third worldization, life is still going to go on. We need to be thinking post-collapsitarian. And I think that has really defined the thinking of the meta right. And that is something that I think deeply about, it had been working on. And what I've come up with so far, and look, I'm not going to pretend that I have all the issues, but I think there are three groups of people we need to attract going forward. And these are, I call them, that the hackers, the hipsters, the hackers, the heretics, and the homesteaders, right? And that's kind of a play on Hansi Freinacht's own meta-modern aristocracy, which is less of an aristocracy as it is a kind of, bougie, yuppie, intellect, cosmopolitan elite. But what I mean by this is, look, by appealing to these sorts of people, right? Homesteaders, that's obvious because, the first step we need to do is appeal to people who want to go off the grid. Now, this might be easier to do in perhaps North America with its excess of land than it might be in Europe. But still, like, even in the cities of Europe, there's nothing that could stop you from maybe have like a balcony, like a little garden on your balcony or your apartment. Or maybe even going off the grid, like trying to buy, your grandfather's old plot of land, especially in countries that might be more suitable to that, such as those in Eastern Europe. The hackers, because we need to attract the people who are, and that's just like a broad word for people who are part of like the tech elite, right? People who work within the tech world who are like web designers or web builders, or like we need to win over people who work in these sorts of fields, for obvious reasons. And the heretics, well, that would be all of us, people who think, you know, who think differently, right? Who understand that something is wrong, who aren't going to be, kind of turned to like these NPCs, and who know that something is deeply, deeply off kilter in the West today, and who are going to be open to these radical, and I would say, maybe even subversive ideas coming from the right. But again, I should reiterate, this is a broad project, and there is no one size fit all solution to this. I really do think that the kind of crisis that we're in, the crisis of late modernity, is going to go on for probably until the end of this century. It's going to be the slow collapse of everything, and I do have faith that things will, y- maybe not get better, but recover in some way. That there will be another equilibrium where normalcy and sanity will return to a world that has been devoid of both for so long. But anyway, I could certainly go on, but I would be happy to take questions at this time if that's okay with you folks.
Yeah,
That's sure okay. Like you mentioned the neo-reactionaries. Do you know the neo-reactionary trichotomy?
Yes, so going back to what I said about like the tech elite, right? So a lot of right, like I was never within the neo-reactionary circle myself, but I have this impression that the neo-reactionary movement, as envisioned by Moldbug and Land, was kind of like it was its own kind of Nietzschean kind of futurism, where basically it was the software programmers would inherit the earth, right? It was this kind of like hyper fascism meets like the Borg or something. I don't. Maybe that's going a little bit too extreme, but yeah, it was basically using like technology and this kind of like Nietzschean value system to create like a new aristocracy where the rulers of this new world would be like a kind of what did Moldbug call it specifically? It was like a so in their system they envisioned something called what was cameralism, I think it was, where a country would be basically run by like a board of directors. It was a very corporate. So what neo-reactionary took was it was a very libertarian, or I would say maybe post-libertarian inspired system, where you had this country that was ruled by a board of directors, and kind of that was answerable to its shareholder citizen class or something. And I don't know how that would have worked out. Again, like one, because I've always despised libertarianism and like the kind of mercantile ethos that it promoted, and that's why I was more into like what was known as the alt-right during that time. Because I had always been involved with like maybe social nationalist or third positionist circles. But Moldbug and Land were on to something. Like they were trying to get at something, and I do respect them for that. They were
Well,
thinking about futures. I'm sorry, you have something to say?
yeah, I'm first going to comment on that. Considering what Moldbog and Land actually were talking about is kind of already happening if you consider that private and public spheres are merging.
Mm-hmm.
You would say that there would be like some sort of neo-feudal capitalist system where it actually some form of more materialist corporatism would be implemented. And from their point of view, considering that they also look into the counter reformation, their ideas can now still be implemented. But what I wanted to specifically ask was if you look at the neo reactionary trichotomy and the imbalance that that clearly shows, especially in modern times, what do you see actually changing in that specific dynamic? Like if you look at how the church and the nobles in the trichotomy stand. There is like this position of democracy between the two. Both changed from to a more materialistic perspective, as in the nobles became the capitalists, and then you had the churches become universities, as in through Marxism. Would you say that to because of the imbalance of the trichotomy, that the position between um, the church, university, the people, and the noblemen, capitalist, and the people would actually create new positions to counteract this imbalance in contrast with democracy? As in, that is momently clearly the system we're working at, but it's like unstable to the point that it will absolutely collapse.
Right. No, and I really do think like it's only a matter of time before the kind of like, let's call it like this inverted system eventually dissolves due to its own internal contradictions. I mean, but finding out like when that's going to happen is it's going to be like, I mean, no one can really predict that. But I think the answer to to I guess counteracting that is to kind of create our own parallel societies, right?
Agreed.
Yeah,
Agreed. As in
yeah,
specifically, like you said, you want to actually, get more of the hackers. Basically, the current counter elite from all several different stripes to form like a cohesive whole that collectively go against the current narrative and status quo to actually, well, have a place in the future. Now, and then also the heretics that actually, disrupt or fill in like a power vacuum in the market place of ideas, especially in a post-truth society, to actually, establish ourselves on stable grounds, which is also understandable that you then also add the homesteaders, which would form quite a cohesive basis to build further upon.
no, exactly, and that's why I kind of like emphasize these three different groups because I think these types of people, who are already kind of helping us kind of create like a future, you know, well, one, maybe I shouldn't be that optimistic, but like who are kind of like maybe opening up a front to help us create a future after postmodernism, right? Or
Yeah,
whatever you want to call
agreed.
it, right?
It doesn't matter if the collapse happens or doesn't happen. Eventually, it will happen, but afterward, with the establishing of these powers on specific fronts, there would be like, yeah, yeah,
Right, they're paving the way. And look,
yeah,
we've already seen that, right? It's like, okay, for example, whatever you think of Elon Musk, and I know his opinions of him are mixed. I do not trust the man myself, but his acquisition of Twitter, for example, has opened up the space for a lot of people in our circles to finally get a foothold within a mainstream social media platform. And look, I love alt tech. I think alt tech is still a thing we need to pursue. But just thinking back to like the great shutting around like 2015, 2016, where rightists were kind of forced off major platforms into more niche platforms like Gab or BitChute, where they just had the misfortune of being turned into echo chambers. We weren't really getting anywhere. And the thing is, like, we have to kind of, at some point, we have to kind of make a breakthrough into normiedom, let's call it, like the normie sphere.
agreed.
Otherwise, yeah, otherwise, again, right, our ideas just kind of get stuck in like an echo chamber. And I think when we have these opportunities presented to us, for example, like the acquisition of Twitter by Musk, which allowed, um, right wing groups to kind of finally get a foothold into a mainstream platform, we should take them. And, there's already going to be like, our, like, these, again, like this hacker group I keep referencing, people who are, I mean, back in the old alt-right days, we would call it like weaponized autism, but it's not a very flattering term. But like people who are
It's a
really,
little bit, but I agree with what you're saying.
Right. And it's like, people who are already primed, the kind of like who do operate in like the tech world, can just use Twitter as a launching pad. And they already have all of their stuff kind of like squared away and good to go to kind of operate within that sphere. Right. Like, we should pursue, these kinds of cracks in the system, if you will, to allow us to maybe operate within like the you know cultural institutions that have been taken away from us, or social media platforms that have been taken away from us. But I am aware that, look, I do not think there is going to be any grand march through the institutions where we kind of take back, like the university system, for example, which I think is just going to have to collapse on its own accord.
Oh, it will collapse automatically.
Yeah,
It's a given.
right.
Now,
And
um, to just talk about meta modernism, like if I understand it correctly, like I'm not so well with the modernism myself, but in how you explained it, would you say that we need to find actually a fusion between, let's say, more certain for aspects of traditionalism, but also modernism, as in how to interact with the current world, keeping in mind post collapse or in the future what the possibilities are to actually properly establish ourselves into the spheres so that we can assure our existence in the future. Is it something like that?
right, well, yes, but there's a lot of and I'm working on a new article at the moment that goes into this. So we need to understand like the origins of where all of this came about. And I would think that, you know, modernism, early modernism, proto modernism, right, really began with with two events, with the English Civil War, and with the Treaty of Westphalia. And the reason I highlight these two events is because with Cromwell, right, we saw the first figure who would overthrow a sovereign who could lay claim to the divine right of kings. And in Westphalia, we had this victory of the nation state over the empire, let's call it, like this transnational um, force that kind of unified all these different nationalities and ethnicities in Europe under a single banner, which was like what, the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic Church back in the High Middle Ages, before it kind of broke into like the nation states of Europe today. And Julius Evola talks about that as well in his books. So in one aspect, I think what modernism really is, it's the victory of ideology over sacred tradition, and it's the triumph of the nation state over the empire, right? And here's the thing: is a lot of us are already postmodern, or even maybe a little even meta modern, even on the right without even knowing it, because you have traditionalists who are also self-avowed nationalists. Even though if you look at like what Evola wrote, he was not a nationalist by any means. He believed in the authority of a local dynasty or ruling class to kind of lay claim to these domains or territories, right?
Yeah, but we should especially not also forget what he was talking about, considering the implications of elite theory and so on. Like, there are like a lot of things, theories, and dynamics going on that we need to actually look into. Like you just did, was also look into history, the possible implications of things that happened, but also what if things happened in another way, what would the results have been, and so on. But in the end, it comes to the point that the basic dynamics of neoliberalism, as in also, the contracts, this or the that, but also the underlying thing of liberalism is that a lot of different other people, groups with other ideologies and ideas could exist and actually interact with each other. But this is going to collapse.
Mhm.
As in, how do you counter that from a point that is not neoliberal and that is actually emphasizes a lot of the points that we all know and feel are true in several kinds of groups all over the spheres that we work in, and we just need like this overarching dynamic that can actually look into such. Otherwise, yeah, the collapse will just be a lot of like tribal groups with specific ideas in a post-apocalyptic world vouching for power and resources.
Yeah, no, I realistically, I think that maybe the most likely scenario, as tragic as it sounds, but I get what you're saying, and I think the answer to that is we need a fourth political theory. Maybe not necessarily like the fourth political theory of like Dugan or and such, but a fourth political theory that kind of provides like a instruction manual of sorts to kind of charting out the collapse, or this post-collapsitarian future.
Mm-hmm.
And I think metapolitics is going to play a big role in that, and I think meta aesthetics as well. This like thinking about futures, lost futures, like futures that were lost to us, during the advent of liberalism, or the pre-war period, right? Thinking about like, well, what could have been, because thinking about what could have been can help us. It can inspire people to look, to kind of think about like forms of art and architecture that could influence us, like going forward, right?
Yeah, I agree. As in, I would even go as far as to say that we need several modes of reductionism to be overlaid upon each other, and several people actually have insight to actually see beyond everything that actually happens. As in, the same thing what you just said about how could things have been and what would be the implications. Follow with that, like all the implications with the material condition, but also with yeah, genetics also influencing our evolution to certain specific ends. Followed with also how we perceive the world from well mythos in general, because everything starts from there. How stories are told, how things are interpreted, and how we project that internal human reality upon the whole of reality to actually navigate ourselves throughout the whole system.
No, absolutely. And I think we need a return to myth. Like, here's the thing, like, one of my biggest gripes with, let's call it like the meta-modern left or the eco-socialist left or whatever you want to call it, there is a figure involved in meta-modernist circles by the name of Brendan Graham Dempsey, who who's since blocked me anyway. But he's a religious scholar, right? And his big work is kind of like trying to figure out a new meta-modern spirituality. And if you even a cursory look of his work is basically just a new atheism with a spiritualist gloss, like something about like meditating and mindfulness or some nonsense. And to us on the right, like that's not gonna fly. And I
Of
think
course,
we
not.
have,
It's
yeah,
spiritually
yeah,
empty. It's impossible.
right. And it's like you can't talk about a real return to transcendence without a return to metaphysics as well. And like that's why I think maybe we on the right are a lot better primed to handle this question than the left, which is essentially, like by its essence, is kind of like a materialist view of the world, which kind of sees the human condition as needing to be solved, like it's a problem to be solved, and the answer is a kind of utopianism. It's like a messianic utopianism. Whereas, on the right, our response to, the human condition is, yeah, human beings might be fallen, but there's nothing inherently wrong with the human being as such. And, I think we on the right are better able to handle this because we have faiths we can turn to, whether they're, some kind of traditionalist Christian faith like the Roman Catholic Church or Eastern Orthodoxy, or some forms of neo-paganism. And within the meta right, especially, right, it seems to be like this dialogue between traditionalist Christianity and Buddhism, of all things. I know for whatever reason, like dealing with meta right circles, there's been this resurgence of like Buddhist thinking. And I think maybe part of that is because metamodernism tends to overlap with another, not necessarily philosophy, but like meta theory called the integral movement, which is the brainchild of a thinker a philosopher by the name of Ken Wilber, who himself is a Buddhist. I think he's a Theravada Buddhist, and he writes a lot about sociopsychology and what's called spiral dynamics, right? And I think a lot of people within integralism and I guess who were involved, like integral folks who were maybe right leaning, who were interested in that kind of socio-psychological aspect and got into Buddhism via that, also wanted something maybe deeper, right? They wanted, like, they didn't see Buddhism or their Buddhism as a kind of like, I don't know, new age gloss to their personality, but really wanted a kind of like, let's call it like
Like,
a tradition.
if I understand it correctly, would you say in essence that it actually, and our position, we indeed play upon like a lot of build up matrimony and patrimony, considering also the spiritual realms, as in Buddhism, Hinduism, paganism, Christianity, doesn't matter. In the end, we all play onto such, as in a strive towards a connection with the numinous in general. And I think there is something there, considering that in essence, that is how we actually define the world and actually traverse through it, is seeing through mythos how we can actually go forward. And the interest in this kind of stuff is, well, yeah, there's something there. Yeah, Sasha, you wanted to say something?
Yes, my question was actually about the last question, or the last answer that Lucas was saying, that we are at the point of the
Sasha?
end of. Yes, wait a second. Yeah, okay, so. Wait. uh, for one. Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, perfect. My mic was off. No, my question that I had was regarding the last answer. You mentioned the end of Western metaphysics, and what I find interesting is, which also Dugan started with this topic, with philosophy of another beginning, of Martin Heidegger. He
Mhm.
also saw that the nihilism that would come forward after the end of Western metaphysics will would be inevitable, and that philosophy would need another beginning, would need another beginning after Western metaphysics, and he turns to sign to being as a pre-metaphysical condition. How do you stand towards the philosophy of Martin Heidegger then?
So I'm actually not very familiar with Heidegger. However, I will say that one of my good friends and colleagues who is also involved in the meta right, or is maybe like a fellow traveler. He is a right metamodernist by the name of Justin Carmine, is a student of Heidegger, and has written a lot of articles about Heidegger, and has actually interviewed Alexander Dugin himself, because they're both disciples of Heideggerian thought. And again, so while I myself am not, I got like 2 pages into Being in Time, and I was like, this is just way over my head. And it's funny because it's like I have read Frederick Jameson's 600 page book on postmodernism, right? The man literally wrote the book on postmodernism, and I managed to get through all 600 pages of that gauntlet, and it was a lot of word salad. Like,
Okay,
it was just a lot of word salad.
Lucas, please hold these comments on Heidegger, because
Oh,
I'm
my bad.
forcing people here to read Heidegger, so
Oh,
they will get a they will lose their motivation to start.
my mistake. My mistake. So, okay, let me
No,
just
no,
get to
no.
what.
Just continue. It's just a
Yeah,
joke.
let me get to what Justin has written. So Justin had recently put out a book with Manticore Press, about first his philosophy of first economics, right, which is heavily inspired by Heideggerian metaphysics. So Justin's answer, and I'm going to go off of Justin because he is more deeply influenced by Heidegger than myself, is that we need a kind of metaphysics from below. And what does he mean by that? So basically, right? So being, or Dasein is like the central element in Heideggerian philosophy. I know that much. So basically, what Justin's answer is, it via Heidegger is like we have like these things in the world, right? Like us as human beings, we interact with the world in different ways. Okay, and like let's say like you and I like we see something like an apple on a stool or a table or something or chair. These are objects that we interact with, and our primordial condition, says Justin, is that we interact with and give meaning to these objects by through our participation in being, right? So, if we see like tree, right, within within like the germ of a tree being a tree, we kind of project our will, maybe, is if that's the right word, onto like tree and think like, oh, tree can be used to turn into a chair. So you have this this relationship.
Extensions of the
Right,
self.
right, there you go, this relationship or extension of yourself by interacting and shaping the natural world, right? Basically what Justin is getting at is like, real metaphysical truths are basically found within our participation in the natural world, right? And this can also extend to our civic participation as well. And he has like this project of like of participation governance, and I think there are some Italian communes, right, or there's small cities in Italy that are actually doing this via what was it, like the Five-Star Movement. It was like you have like this kind of almost like this very grassroots kind of civic participation in these certain Italian communes that are basically kind of shaping the way they want their municipalities to function through a kind of like civic participation and civic consciousness that's kind of like shaping their polity, right? And Justin uses the Greek word polis for a lot of for his political unit, right? Whether that's a city itself or a nation state. Basically, I guess my answer, which would be heavily influenced by Justin's own Heideggerianism, is it may have to be a kind of participatory governance of sorts, where we want to establish not a utopia, but like a protopia, where we have like a conception of what we want our our city or our nation or our community to look like. Like, it's we, the actual demos, right? We, the demos, the people, or the folk, or the Gemeinschaft, or whatever you want to call it, are 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 kind of using our will as an extension of ourself to kind of change things and order things to suit our needs as a unified political unit. And
That
it's kind of
makes me
like,
think about a certain controversial philosopher, but in a system that is a little bit more decentralized. Like, would you say that it's like a collection of will through us as a whole, something like that, expressed onto the polity?
it really depends on like where you're starting, right? In Justin's model, he kind of breaks up the United States, which he's an American from Chicago, right? So he basically uses his focus in North America, but I think Europe is probably a little better, is in a better position to do this, given that you have like these communes and cities and nations that go back centuries and have a collective identity for themselves, and and are not large, right? I think the larger a unit is, the harder this would be able to implement. But in America, we also have the benefit of, like I said before, we have just like what was it, like 900 million acres of land or something that aren't being utilized in the U.S. And we that gives us an opportunity to maybe like establish our own protopias, right? I mean, think about it, right? The state of Utah, you know, began as a isolated religious community, the Mormons, fleeing civilized American society. They went into the desert as a estranged religious group, and now they are a religious community that occupies a state that is 6 million people strong. That is astounding. Or the Amish, right? And keep in mind, it's always these religious communities like the Amish or the Mormons that are projected. I mean, they're going to double every single generation. The Amish in particular have doubled every single generation since the founding of this country. So it
Yes.
really is, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
so it really is going to be these well-established communities that have a deep connection to each other with themselves that may really inherit the future, right? And I think taking this idea of protopia or the intentional community in this kind of value-based participant or this value-based participatory governance, this utilizing maybe like this metaphysics from below could be, a step forward towards getting us out of this mess.
Okay, Luca. Sasha wants to say something.
Yeah,
Sure.
one writer who hasn't been mentioned today, Oswald Spengler, said that civilizations always come into existence with the form of a new way of, not necessarily maybe religion, but essentially the way that we look at our ancestors and the people that are dead and that have gone before us. Um, your analysis about the Mormons and Utah, that it just start a new civilization from within, actually resonates with that idea that and that it's always religious communities. So
Agreed.
maybe a new kind of religious communities will rise again. But Spengler mentioned it will be probably in about 200 years, according to his compares is well comparative method and analysis that he wrote down in Decline of the West.
Absolutely right. No, and Spengler, look, like I'll say this, like, so Decline of the West was like my Bible growing up in as a teenager, early adult. Like that book had a, in fact, I would say that book got me out of socialism. Like I was dabbling maybe in socialism as a young man, but at some point you can't reconcile, this kind of belief in welfarism and all this stuff with Spenglerian historiography, right? I mean, this kind of utopian view of the world and the deep historical pessimism that influenced Spengler's worldview, just that you can't reconcile them. And yeah, like I think those religious communities. And here's the thing: is there was an article I read a while back about why left wing utopias always fail, right? Like, and typically when you have like these left wing communities or communes or utopias, they're basically a bunch of intellectuals who get together and they don't do anything, right? They don't know how to farm, they don't know how to sew or make clothes or do anything useful, right? It's basically an intellectual retreat. Whereas the right, or rather like these religious communities in America have always managed to hold on and survive far longer than their left wing or socialist utopian counterparts. And right, so I do think that religious communities or these communities that are bound together by a shared sense of themselves, even like, and I would even extend this to communities like Orania in South Africa, who I think are in a much better position to kind of inherit the future after the slow death of the system, or after the collapse, if you want to call it that. Like, and I do think, I think global collapse is going to be a slow burn. It's going to be the slow thoroughbroadization of the global north. But I do think that there will be communities who pull through simply due to their ingenuity and wit. I still maintain a very strong faith in that.
Yeah, definitely. Such a
Yeah, I've regarding to that, we just spoke earlier about the end of Western metaphysics because a lot of like Christianity is pretty much based on Platonism, as we know.
Hmm.
Um, and with the end of Western metaphysics, you say it won't be probably what comes after won't be Christianity revived as because of the end of Western metaphysics. Maybe if well, how I read Heidegger or how I understand him, I may be wrong, but it is like a new start of philosophy and a new start of a religion after the metaphysics and with being as a replacement of a godly image, but with a imminent worldview, maybe. So at that point, Van Inees, we come back to philosophy of another beginning, and maybe that's a new way of thinking, which resonates a lot with Chinese Taoism. So maybe that holds the future.
Quite possibly. And thinking back to Severin's book on metamodernism and the return to transcendence, right? So basically, we have lost our feeling of the transcendent for what is imminent, right? For what is in front of us, and Severin, and that's a lot, and that's mainly due to postmodern deconstructivism, right? So if modernism was defined by a belief in progress, a belief in utopia, a belief in man's triumph over nature, his innate ability to utilize technology to kind of enforce his will on the planet, right? Modernity was the great age of the imperial project, right? Of like, I mean, we had like the great theories of modernity, like via Dugan, liberalism, fascism, and communism, right? These great, world changing ideologies that wanted to shape the course of human history in their own image, right? And postmodernism was the denial of grand narratives or meta narratives. It was the denial via like deconstruction of our beliefs in progress, or that there really is like a teleological end to anything. And metamodernism, right? Metamodernism, I should emphasize, it is not a philosophical term via Severin. It is a historical term. It's not a political term. It's a historical term. It's getting to something like where we are in this moment and where we're going. And I think what this kind of future after post modernity is probably going to kind of kick off next, probably next decade, if not already, because post modernity can't, like, it can only deconstruct, it can only dissolve what has already been built up, right? And we see this, vividly in, the university system and the destruction of all of the, what do you call them, like the great master categories, right? The deconstruction of the master categories, such as religious studies or philosophy or literature, the humanities, let's call it, right? And I mean, my God, these subjects of study have, you know been destroyed by, I guess you could say, like, deconstructivism, or if I wanted to be really pejorative, cultural Marxism. Although I don't particularly like that term, because I don't think Adorno and company were as influential as people give them credit for. I think really the fault lies with the post structuralist school, people like Derrida and Foucault and the rest of them. But that's neither here or there. But really, like, what we need in terms of metaphysics is getting to this kind of immanent transcendence. Something that's outside of us, right? That is outside and beyond us, but is also in front of us, and before us, right? And I think even Bowden, rest his soul, was about this as well. Um, but yeah, I don't know what that this new metaphysics might be. It might be a kind of metaphysics from below, as my friend Justin has envisioned, or it might be a kind of weird return to tradition, or it might be something completely new, something we don't even see coming, like a new kind of I don't know, like what did like the traditionalist scholar Saeed Hossein Nasser says that every great world religion is basically like an echo. It's an echo in the mind of God, and maybe it'll be something like that. Maybe it'll be a new echo that we just kind of hear the call and are drawn to. But who can say?
Uh, okay, thank you very much for that answer. I will really recommend if being
Did
in
I lose you,
time
gentlemen?
is
Or are you still good?
oh,
No, we're just contemplating.
Okay.
1 second.
Yes, I mean,
Okay. Yes.
oh,
Just thank you for answering that question. I would really recommend to read Philosophy of Another Beginning because I only understood Alexander Dugin's For Political Theory
mhm.
in depth, really, and because you have the high Dugin and the low Dugin. The provocative Dugin is quite easy to understand sometimes. He's quite straightforward to that. But the really the essence of the fourth political theory is not comprehensible without understanding a notion of Martin Heidegger. And
Mhm.
I was searching through Martin Heidegger, I had the same thing about being in time. After a few pages, I went to an existential crisis myself, and I lost all my self confidence, certainly on intellectual level as well. But then I have read Philosophy of Another Beginning from Dugin, and that's like a little bit more simple version than being in time, and that just really emphasizes that particular question of the end of Western metaphysics
Right.
again. So that
I've
really
actually written
combines,
about
with
Dugin.
Spengler and Heidegger, and that point of a new beginning of philosophy and maybe religion as well.
Right. No, I've actually written a little bit about Dugin's thought in another article I have up at Metanaissance under the title Future Kampf, right? Which is, it's basically like a really quick analysis of his metaphysics as presented in the fourth political theory. And I kind of use that to kind of prop up. I mean, I say my own, but the term future comp is another thing I've kind of cheerfully ripped off from my friend and colleague Kashif. But anyway, so let me just say this: the idea of the lost future is something that we in the meta right kind of like, that's become one of our central ideas, is like these lost futures, and that's something we kind of took from a left wing thinker by the name of Mark Fisher. He was an English writer and blogger and cultural critic. Although, to be fair, I think we do more justice to the term lost future than Fisher did, because his vision of a lost future is some kind of like expanded welfare system that was kind of interrupted by the arrival of Thatcherite neoliberalism, and it's not very like profound, but going back to future comps, right, and using Dugin's metaphysics, particularly his metaphysics about time, right? So, like, I make the argument that all important struggles, like the struggle between peoples or cultures or civilizations or factions or elites, is really the reproduction. Well, first of all, it's the reproduction of power, and secondly, it's a battle for the future, because like we have like these civilizations of space and these civilizations of time, right? And all great, like, urbanized, or let's call them like what Spengler would call like the high cultures, they're civilizations of time, whereas like maybe the nomads are civilizations of space, right? And all important events that happen within the sphere of these civilizations of time are basically trying to like condense time to fit like these great meta narratives. And I think Dugan touches about this as well, in the latter chapters of the fourth political theory. But the essence of future conf, as I've written about it, is like it's like this great oscillation between will and power, aesthetic and language, and past and future, right? And basically, what did Kashif once tell me? He told me that something along the lines of like aesthetic is basically like our aesthetic, right? Is basically the future, or I'm sorry, the past trying to remember itself. And I know that sounds very esoteric, but he is a kind of esoteric thinker. But it's more of like, like the future remembering itself as past. And that's why we can kind of think of these things, these events of like lost futures, or these kind of protopias, or these visions of a future maybe without liberalism, or had West
Recording has stopped.
or had Western civilization gone a different course, you know.
No. Okay. Thank you for your question, for your answer once more. And I have to. I will probably close down in a few minutes.
Sure, sure.
Is there any last question maybe from the audience? Yeah, that's all. No. Okay, then there is just left me with a big warm thank you for Lucas for this entertaining interview. It was you left me with a few questions about
Sure.
the historical perspective of our political struggle that is maybe still not thought through by the with most right-winged political systems. We'll see what will happen, but we will have some time to think about that anyway. So thank you very much for this conversation, Lucas, and we'll keep your work closely to us, and maybe we'll have you again some other time in the future.
Well, thank you. I very much appreciate you folks having me on.
Thank you.